Okay, welcome to this noontime event here in California. We have guests and participants from various parts of the world that I saw, at least, and the event is around the topic of the politics of institutional neutrality, ambiguity, fear, and the effort to silence higher education in the USA. And that's the title of an interesting article that was published in Frontiers in their education section by our speakers today. And so I'm really pleased to be able to introduce them to you. Curtis Brewer is an associate professor at the University of San Antonio, and before that he was at Clemson, and got his PhD at UT Austin. And so really great to have you, Curtis. And then Michelle Young, who is the Dean of the Berkeley School of Education here on the Berkeley campus. And she's been in that role for a little over a year. Is that correct, Michelle? Did I get that right? Oh my gosh, sorry. Well, I really lose track of time. So, but Michelle came to us from the University of Texas, Austin. And so we have a lot of Texans in the UC system now, because our current president of the system is also a University of Texas system veteran. Anyway, great to have you both here. They're both very accomplished scholars, and they wrote this interesting article, and I thought it would be good to engage with them about it. And so without any further ado, we'll let them do a 15-minute or so presentation. I have some discussion, some questions for them, and then I will look online. So please think about what questions you might want to ask them, and we'll try to get to them within the hour slot of our talk. So Curtis and Michelle.
All right, thank you very much. We have a few slides that I'm going to share, and I'll let Michelle say hello.
Hello, everybody. We're going to, as John said, do a 15-minute presentation and look forward to chatting about it in a bit. And Curtis is going to kick us off.
All right. In this paper, we open with a meeting that was reported in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. And it was a dinner that was happening just after the election in 2024. And it was a group of university presidents, and they were discussing the implications for this new electoral outcome. And, in the report, it mentioned just how tense the leaders were and how palatable anxiety was. And as they talked through different issues, the conversation turned to the idea of institutional neutrality, arguing that universities should avoid taking public positions on contested political issues. And some of the presidents felt like that was a right approach. Others raised concern that, if a university remains silent when their core values are threatened, then what exactly are they protecting by being silent? So that led us to think about this in terms of a policy question. In a sense, we were interested in institutional neutrality and its adoption and the reasons for that adoption. And we also wanted to place it in terms of the historical context. So we found data collected by Heterodox that said that pre-2023 there had only been about 10 adopters of a public institutional neutrality statement. By 2024, there was 148 adopters, and that's only increased over this time. And we were interested in, if people are adopting this left and right, then what work does it do in the educational landscape politically? And, there was also a recognition that there's been plenty written on institutional neutrality and plenty critique of it. And so we were interested in trying to understand why these institutions would do this. So what we did in the paper is we laid out a political arc, or a arc of history that looks at the politics of this problem. And you could understand this as divided into three sections. The first phase would be the 1960s to the 1980s. The next phase is the 90s to the 2010s, and then the next phase is more recent times. But in the arc of history, one of the things we point out is that it really gained steam in the late 60s and early 70s with regards to the conservative movement attempting to alert people that the university was a political problem to conservative values. And so, for example, in 1971, the Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell wrote a confidential memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce where he cautioned that the intellectual community is engaged in a long-range and sustained effort to undermine the American free enterprise system. And that was in 71. And not long after that, in 72, Nixon was quoted as saying, "The professors are the enemy, the professors are the enemy. Write that on the blackboard 100 times and never forget it." At the same time, through the 60s and 70s and 80s, we had the development of nonprofits, foundations that were developed by the Koch family, and their goal was to be deliberate about getting university programs and faculty positions funded with the objective of disseminating libertarian ideas. So there was an attempt to infuse libertarian ideas into the academia, as well as an attempt to identify them as a problem and a place of liberal indoctrination. In phase two, in the 90s especially, you see a spokesperson pop up, Lynn Cheney, who was the wife of the future vice president at that time, accused the universities of being dominated by liberal elite who were out of touch. And she developed a rhetoric and started to portray universities as adrift and undermine their credibility in the public. This was mainly through the debate around historical standards for the K-12 area. In addition, you have simultaneous foundations like the Madison Center for Educational Affairs working with student newspapers to help them identify free speech issues as well as leftist type curriculum. They developed a system where they had 70 conservative newspapers on 66 campuses, and the foundation even provided a toll-free hotline to provide technical assistance around editorial issues. In addition, there has been among the elites an attempt to rein in the political correctness of the universities through the trustees. So the American Council of Trustees and Alumni published reports that castigated universities for not being patriotic post 9/11, and that the former president of Yale published a document called The Governance of a New Era, a blueprint for higher education trustees, in which he called for more oversight by trustees to protect campuses from political correctness. What is interesting is in this movement against the universities and the idea that they were harming free speech, there was a push for more scrutiny of faculty speech and restrictions on academic freedom. And when calls like that started to happen, then you saw the conservative think tanks pushing the idea of institutional neutrality and making sure that institutions could adopt statements of neutrality. And in some cases, sponsoring legislation, such as in 2017, to make state institutions declare a public statement of neutrality. And this passed in North Carolina and Indiana at the time. And then in a simultaneous way, we had conservative figures such as the current vice president engaging in the rhetoric of the past and using the idea of universities as the enemy. In fact, he said the universities are fundamentally corrupt and dedicated to deceit and lies, not to truth. And he concluded his speech by declaring Nixon was a saint and that professors are the enemy. And so what you have is you have an ongoing attempt to control the university and simultaneously demonizing the university. Now, when they came to power more recently and they wanted anti-protest bills passed, the ideas on freedom of speech on campus were reversed, and a climate of fear started to sink in across the higher education system. So what we see is that, the universities are promised protection by being neutral, but in actuality, this extended attack on the university hasn't gone away since the declaration of neutrality by different universities. So we were trying to make sense of how is it that universities have been positioned as simple ideological institutions that need to be controlled. And so Michelle's going to describe the ways our framework help us make sense of that.
Thanks, Curtis. So as Curtis was just sharing, we've seen a number of universities adopting institutional neutrality as a way to kind of protect academic freedom, so that universities remain this place for open spaces of diverse viewpoints and so forth. But when we look more closely, the relationships between neutrality and academic freedom are a lot less clear. In fact, one of the things that motivated this paper was this growing sense that neutrality may not simply be protecting universities, it actually seems to be reshaping how universities understand their own role in society. So our paper asks a few fairly simple questions, but very important ones. And the first one is, what political work does the idea of institutional neutrality actually perform in contemporary higher education? And is it a protective strategy, or does it reflect something deeper about the political environment which universities are operating today? So our central argument, I just posted in the chat, is that institutional neutrality is not simply a political governance strategy. It's a policy response that's shaped, as Curtis just shared, by decades of political narrative building. And in order to examine those questions that I shared, we use a critical policy analysis approach, drawing on a historical lens, because our goal wasn't just to describe the rise of institutional neutrality, but it's also to look at how it's been constructed, how it's functioning, and what the current environment, what it's actually doing, that is, within the current political environment. So to do that, we have drawn on three political theoretical frameworks. The first one is Deborah Stone's work on policy narratives. For those of you who are familiar with her work, Stone reminds us that policy debates are not driven primarily by evidence or technical reasoning. Rather, they're driven by stories about problems. And in this case, the higher education story is about decline and about what's gone wrong and what needs to be fixed. So for higher education, the narrative is a pretty powerful one that casts universities as ideologically based, disconnected from public values, and in need of some serious correction. And this narrative helps to explain why policies like institutional neutrality have gained such traction, because they are responding essentially to a constructed problem, not just a material one. So the second framework that we're drawing on is from Henry Giroux, and it's his notion of the disimagination machine. So Giroux argues that the neoliberal culture, which works through media and markets and political discourse, has gradually reshaped the way that public institutions like higher education are understood. So universities are no longer widely seen as democratic public goods. Instead, they become increasingly framed as private investments, as workforce development engines, or as ideological institutions. So this reframing narrows what people think about when they think about a university. And this also narrows what people think that universities should be doing. So in that context, institutional neutrality can also be understood as a broader shift in the way that universities are being positioned within society. So the third framework that we used in our work came from Barry Glassner's work on the culture of fear. And in his work, Glassner shows how fear operates as a powerful political tool and how narratives about risk and about threat can shape public opinion. And they can also shape policy decisions, often regardless, again, drawing back on Stone, of having any empirical evidence. So in higher education, we see this in recurring fears about indoctrination, about campus radicalism, and about threats to free speech. So these fears create a policy environment in which universities then feel pressure to respond, and institutional neutrality can emerge as one strategy for managing that pressure. And of course, the other way that we're seeing the culture of fear operating is that it has a chilling effect on universities not really knowing what they should do in this particular environment. So when you take these three frameworks together, they help us see that institutional neutrality is not simply neutral. It's not a technical governance choice that institutions are making. It's about a political outcome that's been shaped by a long-standing narrative about higher education, by shifts in how universities are understood by society, and by a climate of fear that's influencing institutional decision-making. And that broader context is really essential for understanding both the rise of neutrality, but also its implications for academic freedom and public role of universities. So this raises this notion of a neutrality paradox that we also talk about in the paper. So we argue that institutional neutrality contains a fundamental paradox, and that is that it's presented as a solution to the pressures that universities are facing. But in practice, it actually may be reproducing and intensifying those pressures. So there are three ways that we see this happening. The first one is that neutrality is far less clear than it appears. Even in the foundational document that Curtis mentioned before, the Calvin Report, which came from the University of Chicago, it includes this very important caveat. It suggests that universities should refrain from taking positions on political issues, except when their core mission or values are at stake. But that exception raises a really important question. Who decides? Who decides when those conditions are met? What counts as a threat to academic freedom? What counts as a threat to a university's mission? What counts as an issue that's central to a university's mission? These aren't technical questions. They are interpretive and they are political. So neutrality does not eliminate judgment. It actually requires judgment. And in that sense, neutrality is not stable. It's not self-executing. It's inherently ambiguous. So a second way is that neutrality is often fear-driven. In the current environment, it's often adopted not simply as a principled stance, but as a response to political risk or political pressure. Universities today, as we all know, are operating in a context of legislative scrutiny, media attention, public narratives that frequently are casting institutions in a negative light. So in that environment, neutrality can function as a form of risk management, as a way to avoid backlash, avoid controversy, avoid political targeting. But that raises an important concern. When neutrality is driven by fear, it may actually narrow institutional decision making rather than protect it. It becomes um, it becomes less a principled commitment and more of a defensive posture. And then finally, um, and this is probably the most important piece of this, is that neutrality may have unintended consequences for how universities are understood and positioned in society. By remaining silent, especially in moments where their core values are under pressure, universities may inadvertently reinforce the very narratives that are portraying them as lacking legitimacy or lacking a purpose. So silence could be interpreted not as neutrality, but as avoidance or disengagement or even tacit agreement. So over time, that can weaken the university's ability to articulate and defend its public mission. So we aren't necessarily arguing for or against, being neutral on any given issue. What we are arguing is that institutional neutrality promises protection, but it may actually reinforce the political narratives that place universities under attack in the first place. So rather than resolving the tensions that universities face, it sometimes reproduces them by obscuring the fact that judgment is important and by responding to fear or by limiting the institution's ability to actually defend itself or defend the conditions that make its work possible. So in that sense, we get cornered by neutrality and it becomes more of a constraint than a shield. So I think that's, in a nutshell, what the paper is about.
Great. Thank you very much. That was a very nice, clean presentation. Appreciate that. I think what I'm going to ask a few questions, and you should be sending a few things on the chat if you have a question. I can try to integrate them into the discussion. But I think, among those probably listening in is the question of how do you operationalize, efforts to actually make institutional advocacy decisions on key issues, whether they are in the Calvin report realm or not, only things that affect the university directly. But how do we operationalize it? And the one thing I would say is that, this is an unusual time. I mean, I know we have similar things we can talk about in terms of the Red Scare and the loyalty oath here at the University of California in an earlier period. But we have multiple battlefronts going on these days, and there are also different environments in red states versus blue states, where advocacy, for example, by a university president might lead to other kinds of problems in one state versus another state. So it's a very kind of broad question, but is there a way to operationalize this now? Are there certain issues that you think universities like the University of California should be more upfront and advocating for?
Well, Curtis, you want to start? You want me to start on this one?
You can start and I'll follow.
Okay. One of the things is that like I said, we don't necessarily have a specific perspective on whether or not a university should speak or not on any given issue, but they should have a principled stance that is based on their mission and their core values. So at the center of most institutions' core values is this notion of academic freedom. And around issues, that would be a really clear issue around which we would think that a university should take a principled stance. Another is protecting the safety of the individuals who work and learn at the institution. So there are a couple of things like that are pretty significant to the mission of an institution. Our analysis suggests that it is precisely though where the ambiguity of institutional neutrality comes in, that it becomes the most consequential, because those are two examples of things that seem quite obvious, but there are other issues that I think require the university to actually have a principled way of going about discernment and making decisions about, what is central to their mission and what is not. And, I think that we do see some of our higher education leaders engaging in that work and really beginning to articulate the things that are most important to their institutions. And this is in alignment with the Calvin Report because it basically says, in its exception, that universities should speak when their core mission or values are under threat. And that the challenge there, again, is that there's no really neutral way to define what some of the more tricky moments might be. Curtis?
Yeah, all I'd add is that in that decision making, centering the responsibility to the stewardship of the university might be a deciding factor, right? Like it's the question has to do with the fundamental work of the university and how that's understood, and also as an opportunity to tell the story again, tell the origin stories, tell the success stories of the university, and in that way speak out, maybe take a position that's opposite of the threat, but at the same time allow for a repositioning of the university.
Well,
Yeah, Don, I think that last part that Curtis just brought up is one really, really important kind of takeaway from the work that we just did, that this notion of institutional neutrality also sort of takes away the opportunity to tell your own story as an institution. And that is something that we think that institutions really should be leaning into, is defining themselves, defining their impact, defining the things that are important to them.
So I think one of the questions is, who is the university and what opinion are they voicing? So, I mean, this is a little bit of a conundrum, I think. University presidents, yeah, they can get out and say, well, don't cut in SF funding or something like that. They can assume that there's a consensus on campus, but maybe in other issues they don't. And so when we're talking about advocacy by the institution in terms of kind of vocal, in opinion pieces or something of that nature, what is their legitimacy in making, say, statements that are perhaps, not mainstream in some form?
Yeah, I'll start on that. So I think that, again, the return to the story of the university is important here. And I think that if we are going to understand the ambiguity and the moments of ambiguity that are out there, then they can be used to reposition the university. And what we're trying to get at is, what is the work of silence and what does it do to our abilities to tell the story?
So I still have a hard time understanding. In other words, if a president comes out and says, stop, supporting students at Harvard, they're a president somewhere else, or other kinds of, specific kind of things, where do they derive their legitimacy to say this kind of statement? I will say that I think Brian Suchek's opinion, he kind of went, and this question was brought up in an interview, and it was like he said, well, shared governance of some sort. I couldn't quite figure it out, but maybe it's better explained in the book. Shared governance, I mean, that that's a really lengthy kind of process. In any case, so I get back to this. What is the legitimacy of a president to say things that are perhaps not mainstream in some form? I mean, I think we all want leadership of some form. I mean, we think of the era like Clark Kerr, and that we needed in this time. But there is this kind of conundrum. And the other thing, as I said before, is it's not like a singular issue. Like there is just so many battlefronts that we're being confronted by the Trump administration that creates a very difficult playing field in order to be a vocal opponent and to make a difference. So, I mean, do you think that presidents should kind of go out and make assumptions and get more out and lead in some form? I mean, there's an argument for that, and I'll give one argument that I know one of our listeners, one of our participants thinks, is that we should be advocating and getting students out there to vote in the midterms. And, you know, you're supposed to be neutral in that, but, you know, you could also couch it in as an existential threat that we face as a society and our universities. So I won't hammer too much more on that, but just that question of legitimacy of a president, since we kind of are focusing on that, I think, as opposed to the board or perhaps a dean, or, you know, that we go into the various aspects that we know that academic freedom is there for faculty and students, then it gets more cloudy when we're talking about people that represent the institution as a whole.
Well, one of the things that we are seeing is that it's primarily the chancellors and presidents who are signing off on statements of institutional neutrality. So in a way, it's you know, kind of leadership at the highest echelons who are determining whether or not their institutions will kind of sign on to whether it's the compact or whatever it is. And you know, as you mentioned, people do look to their leaders to kind of lead, and you know, university presidents both have that opportunity to revive and retell and make contemporary stories about what their institution is about. But they also have the long arc of history from their own institutions where they can point to the values that give the university its identity. And it's those values that enable it to face the more existential threats, like threats to academic freedom. You would expect, I mean, I would expect leaders to speak on behalf of the institution about the importance to the very identity of our institution around academic freedom, and I think we are happily seeing that, which is good. But leadership, even in that sense, will require judgment. You know, what is said, what is not said. That's, I mean, sometimes just as important as what is said when it comes to issues of neutrality. You know, I think one risk is that, you know, we can come up with some sort of simple dreamed up notion that neutrality becomes a replacement for the kind of judgment that we're actually looking from leaders. And yes, leaders are not the university, but leaders are in a position where they are having to speak for the university. So, you know, it's important to make sure that they have the right that they are actually pointing to our values and to the goals and the guiding principles of the institution when they're doing that speaking, is how I would answer your question, John.
Well, you know, this one of the questions that's come up. I've got two, and then I'm going to go to Brian Murphy. Was specific, very definite ideas on this, and but one question that's brought up that I had on my list is the difference between public and private institutions. And, you know, historically, I would say with some exceptions, public universities, I'm talking about, you know, the 1950s and earlier, tended to really avoid any political viewpoint. I mean, there were obviously political things going on all the time, but presidents often you didn't know what their party was. You know, it was a nonpartisan conceptual idea of what they did. So back to this question in the modern era, is there a difference? Is this just a universal principle, you think? Or are there kind of circumstantial differences between a public and a private? As I said, too, also a red and a blue state, like what is the consequences? How can you be effective? That kind of thing.
Well, I will just also just say that our paper explores how political pressures, regardless of the administration, can shape institutional behavior through this kind of fear and uncertainty. But I think what is distinctive about the current context, which you're alluding to, is the fact that these pressures have real threats. So, you know, Michael Roth of Wesleyan University has commented that many university presidents have confided in him that they're fearful for their own personal safety or public harassment. So that's a little different than what you were describing, John. But the intensity of pressure and the very directness of that pressure on certain institutions, kind of public bullying, legal and fiscal threats, institutions have to assess risk, definitely. And our concern is also that fear-based decision making can be exploited. And then that narrows our commitment to our principles of academic freedom and so forth. So, there are no easy answers here, but it is essential that institutions are grappling with this and not necessarily thinking that by signing off on an institutional neutrality statement that somehow they are going to be saved, or that they're going to not have to make those statements, because at some point they actually may, simply because it's core to their not just their mission, but possibly even just the survival of their own institution. But they're definitely not like things that can be trifled with or underestimated in any way. Curtis, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Just a little bit. The difference between public and private is real. And so, yes, it will be part of that responsibility decision making that the president or whomever needs to do. So, in our paper, what we see is that, in fact, if it's not a universal principle, this neutrality, and it's something that has to constantly be negotiated.
Okay, so, I know these are really hard questions. I'm not pretending, this is an easy thing to navigate. I think it is very challenging. One question that was brought up that also related to an earlier question I got from Steve Brent, but this one's from Zeus Leonardo here on campus. And he brings up the difference between neutrality and objectivity. I think if I understand this correctly, and that is that, there are things that are, well, maybe I'm not interpreting. I was thinking a little bit more the way that Steve Brent put it was, well, there are some things that are prudent. In other words, I guess this gets back to selecting where you're going to fight and put up a position. Is there a way to kind of navigate through that? And what I would, just as an example, I think if we contrast Harvard versus the UC system thus far, with lots of question marks coming down our way, is that Harvard really put up a big fight and said it had, very specific, concerns that relate to their mission and their role and their First Amendment rights and academic freedom. And the UC has kind of not been so confrontational and not, making some statements, but they're very bland, and not finding legal recourse, for example, and that kind of thing. And at least thus far, at the moment, it seems like that prudence is paying off, and to some extent. Not that it all could change tomorrow, because it's so volatile under this administration, and they have a huge toolbox that they keep going into. But this gets back to this question: is like, well, maybe there are times like these times are not the same as, say, 3 years ago, even, and that your selection of what issues you're going to really make a stand on, never mind whether you're signed on to the Calvin report or not. It's just you're making these choices, and they might. What is the effectiveness of what choice you make?
If you don't mind, John, I'd like to answer that by also answering Zeus's question as I'm understanding what he's asking. So I think it is really important to make a distinction between neutrality and objectivity, because institutional neutrality is an institutional posture about whether or not to take positions. Objectivity is more, as you know, Zeus, is more of an epistemic commitment about how knowledge is produced and evaluated. So an institution can reject neutrality. It can reject and choose to speak on the things that are important to it. but it can still uphold objectivity, evidence-based reasoning, openness to critique, and so forth and so on. So neutrality is more about whether or not institution is able to use its voice, and objectivity is more about how we know whether or not we say it was true or something. So how does this, so why neutrality is problematic as we see it is because it's so incredibly ambiguous. Fear driven, again, it can silence institutions about critical moments. It can reinforce narratives that undermine the university itself. So I think we can aim for objectivity and subjectivity without giving into this notion of institutional neutrality.
All right, I'm gonna, Brian Murphy, I think has a question for you. If you can unmute yourself, Brian.
Thanks, John. Thank
Maybe
you.
introduce yourself briefly.
I'm an associate at the center here at the Study of Higher Education. I'm the past president at De Anza College in Cupertino for years and years. And I've been very deeply involved in the work at Penn America and others around the effort to organize both past presidents and current ones. Far more success in the first category than the second, in active resistance to the current regime. Thank you very much for the work. I mean, it is a really important essay to kind of remind people that institutional neutrality isn't, and it has a political history. Two things struck me. One is in all of the analyses, Giroux, Stone, Glasner's, the use of them to portray the histories, if you will, I'm struck by the relative lack of agency on the part of universities themselves. Their lack of engagement over decades in defining in a more aggressive way what a positive role they have in society is, which then leaves you very, very isolated when this reactionary attack happens. It's an old Union saying that it's too late to make a friend when you need a friend. And universities like Berkeley and hundreds and hundreds of other institutions have lots of relationships to communities and folks outside who could be allies if anybody had ever thought to be more deeply engaged with them. So that's the first thing. It's just this idea of agency is largely missing, and that legacy I think we are living with. The one thing that I want to ask in your own, I realize you didn't do an empirical analysis of how others have handled this, but your use of the Kelvin report as a kind of, if you will, ideological moment, I think is very useful only if you really do emphasize the mission and values. I don't know of an institution in the country that doesn't, in their mission and values statement, have a commitment to diversity, equity, and democracy. In other words, it's not just academic freedom. It's academic freedom in the service of democracy, equity, diversity, virtually. And it's not simply political correctness that led to the inclusion of those other words. It's decades of struggle around civil rights, access, and equality. Universities have been partisan in that struggle. And they're partisan whether they had Republican or Democratic registered presidents, because their mission in terms of the diversity of knowledge, the use of knowledge in the society and the culture, was committed to this at least implicit social democratic ideal. And so now I think we're in a situation where it's hard to know what the counter narrative, which is finally what my question is. What, in your view, would be a counter narrative to the false neutrality narrative? Because, and then just an observation, I would venture to say that 2 days from now, the majority of men and women whose faces I see on these screens, you will participate in the No King's March, one place or another. And yet you work in an institution that did, in my view, nothing to facilitate or in other ways even alert you to the fact that that's happening. So all across the country, another another banking system, if you will, of legitimacy is being noticed. The building of resistance against this regime does not currently count on universities.
Okay, let's let them respond about the counter narrative or whatever you'd like to respond to.
Sure. Yeah, as far as a counter narrative, I think that is the work that needs to be done. I think, in the paper, there wasn't space necessarily to track the response of universities to the different movements, but by the conservatives. But I would argue that something you brought up at the beginning, which is solidarity amongst institutions, would help, right? Like there has to be a common story across universities, given that they're driving towards the same or from the same tradition towards some mission. I think that it is in that potential for solidarity that while the word objective was used earlier, it might just be we can't necessarily have an objective answer to whether or not these attacks are helpful, but we can have a common sense answer. We can have an answer that where there's enough of us saying this goes against what we do at our institution, and it goes against what is happening at the next door institution and the next door institution. Now, I haven't seen a proliferation of that. In the paper, we mentioned the Big Ten Compact, but since then, it seems as though there hasn't been much to it. But yeah, to get at your question, what I would argue is universities working in solidarity to develop a common sense about what universities do and why they're valuable is the beginning of the counter narrative.
I'd only say that that American higher education is a diverse grouping of institutions, not with all the same interests. And research universities are the ones who have been bearing the brunt of this particular attack because they have leverage related to federal funding and these kinds of things. So, it makes it harder to think of a narrative, unless you can't come up with one. Excuse me. But this, I'm sorry, relates to the question that Zach Pardos has put on, and that is, where is that voice? You're making the argument, Curtis, that there needs to be a collective response. And I can say, well, there have been versions of that with the AAU and the AAUP, and in fact, they've been relatively effective at first, not looking like they were in the halls of Congress in terms of the science funding cuts that didn't happen, although I still think things are going to be happening in that regard. So it's a what is that effective, not just the narrative, but I don't think we really have a place anymore for the big higher ed leader with a voice, a national voice. I mean, that's been kind of one of the arguments. That era of the Kerr era has faded away. James Conant Bryant, and those kinds of people, and now it's just within this realm is so challenging. So I'm sorry, again, I'm wandering here, but is it, or do we need to create collective voice, or is it really a fight, by individual institutions to try to affect this avalanche of executive orders and such?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both and, right? I mean, like we were getting at, everybody's threshold for whether to speak up or not is contextual in almost every way. So there's never going to be the opportunity to be lockstep, but at the same time, there can be networks of universities that are able to position themselves in relationship to a larger mission they all hold. I mean, and I'm speaking in the ideal,
Yeah. No, I think you're right on the right track there, Curtis, because as several people have alluded to, collective action is necessary, but it also has to be strategic, and it has to be bounded, and it has to be mission anchored. So it can't necessarily be a stream of joint advocacy. If the challenge is to this idea of higher education as a public good, then a single institution, obviously reframing itself, isn't going to shift the narrative. It is going to require coordinated work across institutions. And we have seen limited efforts to try and do something like that. But it also required making sure that individual institutions are very clear about the fact that they are not neutral. They are responsible. They are responsible to their own mission. They're responsible to their community. They're responsible to the kind of the whatever the mission of greater good it is that they're serving as a public institution, obviously, or even as a private institutions. But collective action matters because narratives are social, and the risk is shared, and legitimacy can scale, but it's not going to scale if it's a single voice.
Well, I would say there's like kind of a long-term project, and that is we have this real decline in public support. There is a big difference between registered Republicans versus Democrats, and you see it's quite clear in the polling about the value of higher ed, and a high percentage of Republicans even saying that higher ed is a detriment of some sort, some kind of evil enterprise. But in any case, we have a long-term project of how to bring back trust, in the midst of these attacks, but in the future as well, about universities and their role in society and as places for diverse opinions and diverse other things as well. Then there are the really specific areas, and this gets back to, in some form, what are you advocating for, and who's your audience? Is it like if you were in Alabama, maybe your audience is the state legislature, or trying to get support from your senators, not to support huge cuts in Medicare, Medicaid funding that will close down your hospitals and these kinds of things. So there's this kind of areas of where you're advocating it for. And so leading to that, one question is like one area that I would think would be really important is the SAVE Act, and opposing the SAVE Act. I'm not, if you're aware, in the SAVE Act, it basically doesn't allow you to register students on campus or in the region. So these big efforts to get out the vote, even if they're neutral, are not there. So only trying to unpack that there are different audiences and different things that you can achieve depending on the institution. And I would hope the SAVE Act might be one of those ones that's more broad.
Right, right. Well, and I would also hope that our professional organizations that represent universities might lean in and provide some leadership here, because you could have AAU, APLU setting the norms, that replacing neutrality with this notion of institutional responsibility and how sectors talk about themselves and how they talk about things like the SAVE Act that are important to them and to their missions. I think we should expect that of our institutions, so that to the point that Zach and I forget who else was making about organized efforts, so that you're not having to it be just an individual institution that is speaking to a specific issue, but redefining the role of the university and its not just whether or not it can speak, but the fact that it, on certain things, it absolutely must and has legitimacy.
Okay, I think we're near the end of our time. So really want to thank you both, and thanks for those who wrote in questions. I got to a fair amount of them, and but appreciate your participation. And this is a challenging issue and a really challenging time. And so, as I said, I think it's what we do in this era and the leadership we can get on key issues is crucial, of course, but it's so problematic when you're dealing with such a hostile environment in the federal level, or depending on what state you're in as well. So with that, thanks so much. Okay, goodbye.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.